Part II, Section 13 of The Maine Woods by Henry David Thoreau. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part II, Chesuncook, Section 13. We all landed at once. My companion reloaded, the Indian fastened his birch, threw off his hat, adjusted his waistband, seized the hatchet, and set out. He told me afterward, casually, that before we landed he had seen a drop of blood on the bank when it was 2 or 3 rods off. He proceeded rapidly up the bank and through the woods, with a peculiar, elastic, noiseless, and stealthy tread, looking to right and left on the ground, and stepping in the faint tracks of the wounded moose, now and then pointing in silence to a single drop of blood on the handsome, shining leaves of the Clintonia borealis, which on every side covered the ground, or to a dry fern stem freshly broken, all the while chewing some leaf or else the spruce gum. I followed, watching his motions more than the trail of the moose. After following the trail about 40 rods in a pretty direct course, stepping over fallen trees and winding between standing ones, he at length lost it, for there were many other moose tracks there, and, returning once more to the last blood stain, traced it a little way and lost it again, and, too soon, I thought, for a good hunter, gave it up entirely. He traced a few steps also the tracks of the calf, but seeing no blood, soon relinquished the search. I observed, while he was tracking the moose, a certain reticence or moderation in him. He did not communicate several observations of interest which he made, as a white man would have done, though they may have leaked out afterward. At another time, when we heard a slight crackling of twigs, and he landed to reconnoitre, he stepped lightly and gracefully, stealing through the bushes with the least possible noise in a way in which no white man does, as it were, finding a place for his foot each time. About half an hour after seeing the moose, we pursued our voyage up Pine Stream, and soon, coming to a part which was very shoal and also rapid, we took out the baggage and proceeded to carry it round, while Joe got up with a canoe alone. We were just completing our portage, and I was absorbed in the plants, admiring the leaves of the aster macrophyllus 10 inches wide, and plucking the seeds of the great round-leaved orchis, when Joe exclaimed from the stream that he had killed a moose. He had found the cow moose lying dead, but quite warm, in the middle of the stream, which was so shallow that it rested on the bottom, with hardly a third of its body above water. It was about an hour after it was shot, and it was swollen with water. It had run about 100 rods and sought the stream again, cutting off a slight bend. No doubt a better hunter would have tracked it to this spot at once. I was surprised at its great size, horse-like, but Joe said it was not a large cow moose. My companion went in search of the calf again. I took hold of the ears of the moose, while Joe pushed his canoe down stream toward a favorable shore, and so we made out, though with some difficulty, its long nose, frequently sticking in the bottom, to drag it into still shallower water. It was a brownish black, or perhaps a dark iron gray on the back and sides, but lighter beneath and in front. I took the cord which served for the canoe's painter, and with Joe's assistance measured it carefully, the greatest distances first, making a knot each time. The painter being wanted, I reduced these measures that night, with equal care, to lengths and fractions of my umbrella, beginning with the smallest measures and untying the knots as I proceeded; and when we arrived at Chesuncook the next day, finding a 2-foot rule there, I reduced the last to feet and inches, and, moreover, I made myself a 2-foot rule of a thin and narrow strip of black ash, which would fold up conveniently to 6 inches. All this pains I took because I did not wish to be obliged to say merely that the moose was very large. Of the various dimensions which I obtained, I will mention only 2. The distance from the tips of the hoofs of the 4 feet stretched out to the top of the back between the shoulders was 7 feet and 5 inches. I can hardly believe my own measure, for this is about 2 feet greater than the height of a tall horse. Indeed, I am now satisfied that this measurement was incorrect, but the other measures given here I can warrant to be correct, having proved them in a more recent visit to those woods. The extreme length was 8 feet and 2 inches. Another cow moose, which I have since measured in those woods with a tape, was just 6 feet from the tip of the hoof to the shoulders, and 8 feet long as she lay. When afterward I asked an Indian at the carry how much taller the male was, he answered 18 inches, and made me observe the height of a cross stake over the fire, more than 4 feet from the ground, to give me some idea of the depth of his chest. Another Indian at Oldtown told me that they were 9 feet high to the top of the back, and that one which he tried weighed 800 pounds. The length of the spinal projections between the shoulders is very great. A white hunter, who was the best authority among hunters that I could have, told me that the male was not 18 inches taller than the female, yet he agreed that he was sometimes 9 feet high to the top of the back, and weighed 1,000 pounds. Only the male has horns, and they rise 2 feet or more above the shoulders, spreading 3 or 4 and sometimes 6 feet, which would make him in all sometimes 11 feet high. According to this calculation, the moose is as tall, though it may not be as large, as the great Irish elk, Megaceros hibernicus, of a former period, of which Mantell says that it very far exceeded in magnitude any living species, the skeleton being upward of 10 feet high from the ground to the highest point of the antlers. Joe said that though the moose shed the whole horn annually, each new horn has an additional prong. But I have noticed that they sometimes have more prongs on one side than on the other. I was struck with the delicacy and tenderness of the hoofs, which divide very far up, and the one half could be pressed very much behind the other, thus probably making the animal surer footed on the uneven ground and slippery moss-covered logs of the primitive forest. They were very unlike the stiff and battered feet of our horses and oxen. The bare, horny part of the forefoot was just 6 inches long, and the two portions could be separated 4 inches at the extremities. The moose is singularly grotesque and awkward to look at. Why should it stand so high at the shoulders? Why have so long a head? Why have no tail to speak of? For in my examination I overlooked it entirely. Naturalists say it is 1.5 inches long. It reminded me at once of the camelopard, long before and low behind, and no wonder, for like it is fitted to browse on trees. The upper lip projected 2 inches beyond the lower for this purpose. This was the kind of man that was at home there, for as near as I can learn, that has never been the residence, but rather the hunting ground of the Indian. The moose will, perhaps, one day become extinct, but how naturally then, when it exists only as a fossil relic, and unseen as that, may the poet or sculptor invent a fabulous animal with similar branching and leafy horns, a sort of fucus or lichen in bone, to be the inhabitant of such a forest as this. Here, just at the head of the murmuring rapids, Joe now proceeded to skin the moose with a pocket knife, while I looked on, and a tragical business it was, to see that still warm and palpitating body pierced with a knife, to see the warm milk stream from the rent udder, and the ghastly naked red carcass appearing from within its seemly robe, which was made to hide it. The ball had passed through the shoulder blade diagonally and lodged under the skin on the opposite side, and was partially flattened. My companion keeps it to show his grandchildren. He has the shanks of another moose, which he has since shot, skinned, and stuffed, ready to be made into boots by putting in a thick leather sole. Joe said if a moose stood fronting you, you must not fire, but advance toward him, for he will turn slowly and give you a fair shot. In the bed of this narrow, wild, and rocky stream, between two lofty walls of spruce and firs, a mere cleft in the forest which the stream had made, this work went on. At length Joe had stripped off the hide and dragged it trailing to the shore, declaring that it weighed 100 pounds, though probably 50 would have been nearer the truth. He cut off a large mass of the meat to carry along, and another, together with the tongue and nose, he put with the hide on the shore to lie there all night, or till we returned. I was surprised that he thought of leaving this meat, thus exposed by the side of the carcass, as the simplest course, not fearing that any creature would touch it, but nothing did. This could hardly have happened on the bank of one of our rivers in the eastern part of Massachusetts, but I suspect that fewer small wild animals are prowling there than with us. Twice, however, in this excursion, I had a glimpse of a species of large mouse. This stream was so withdrawn, and the moose tracks were so fresh, that my companions, still bent on hunting, concluded to go farther up it and camp, and then hunt up or down at night. Half a mile above this, at a place where I saw the aster puniceus, and the beaked hazel as we paddled along, Joe, hearing a slight rustling amid the alders, and seeing something black about 2 rods off, jumped up and whispered, "Bear!" But before the hunter had discharged his piece, he corrected himself to "beaver," hedgehog. The bullet killed a large hedgehog more than 2 feet and 8 inches long. The quills were rayed out and flattened on the hinder part of its back, even as if it had lain on that part, but were erect and long between this and the tail. Their points, closely examined, were seen to be finely bearded or barbed, and shaped like an awl, that is, a little concave, to give the barbs effect. After about a mile of still water, we prepared our camp on the right side, just at the foot of a considerable fall. Little chopping was done that night, for fear of scaring the moose. We had moose meat fried for supper. It tasted like tender beef, with perhaps more flavor, sometimes like veal. After supper, the moon having risen, we proceeded to hunt a mile up the stream, first carrying about the falls. We made a picturesque sight, wending single file along the shore, climbing over rocks and logs. Joe, who brought up the rear, twirling his canoe in his hands as if it were a feather, in places where it was difficult to get along without a burden. We launched the canoe again from the ledge over which the stream fell, but after half a mile of still water, suitable for hunting, it became rapid again, and we were compelled to make our way along the shore, while Joe endeavored to get up in the birch alone, though it was still very difficult for him to pick his way amid the rocks in the night. We on the shore found the worst of walking, a perfect chaos of fallen and drifted trees, and of bushes projecting far over the water, and now and then we made our way across the mouth of a small tributary on a kind of network of alders. So we went, tumbling on in the dark, being on the shady side, effectually scaring all the moose and bears that might be thereabouts. At length we came to a standstill, and Joe went forward to reconnoitre, but he reported that it was still a continuous rapid as far as he went, or half a mile, with no prospect of improvement, as if it were coming down from a mountain. So we turned about, hunting back to the camp through the still water. It was a splendid moonlight night, and I, getting sleepy as it grew late, for I had nothing to do, found it difficult to realize where I was. This stream was much more unfrequented than the main one, lumbering operations being no longer carried on in this quarter. It was only 3 or 4 rods wide, but the firs and spruce through which it trickled seemed yet taller by contrast. Being in this dreamy state, which the moonlight enhanced, I did not clearly discern the shore, but seemed most of the time to be floating through ornamental grounds, for I associated the fir tops with such scenes. Very high up some Broadway, and beneath or between their tops, I thought I saw an endless succession of porticos and columns, cornices and facades, verandas and churches. I did not merely fancy this, but in my drowsy state such was the illusion. I fairly lost myself in sleep several times, still dreaming of that architecture and the nobility that dwelt behind and might issue from it, but all at once I would be aroused and brought back to a sense of my actual position by the sound of Joe's birch horn in the midst of all this silence calling the moose, "Ung, ung, oo," and I prepared to hear a furious moose come rushing and crashing through the forest, and see him burst out onto the little strip of meadow by our side. But on more accounts than one I had had enough of moose hunting. I had not come to the woods for this purpose, nor had I foreseen it, though I had been willing to learn how the Indian maneuvered. But one moose killed was as good, if not as bad, as a dozen. The afternoon's tragedy, and my share in it, as it affected the innocents, destroyed the pleasure of my adventure. It is true, I came as near as is possible to come to being a hunter and miss it myself, and as it is, I think that I could spend a year in the woods fishing and hunting just enough to sustain myself with satisfaction. This would be next to living like a philosopher on the fruits of the earth, which you would raise, which also attracts me. But this hunting of the moose merely for the satisfaction of killing him, not even for the sake of his hide, without making any extraordinary exertion or running any risk yourself, is too much like going out by night to some woodside pasture and shooting your neighbor's horses. These are God's own horses, poor timid creatures, that will run fast enough as soon as they smell you, though they are 9 feet high. Joe told us of some hunters who a year or two before had shot down several oxen by night somewhere in the Maine woods, mistaking them for moose. And so might any of the hunters. And what is the difference in the sport but the name? In the former case, having killed one of God's and your own oxen, you strip off its hide, because that is the common trophy, and moreover you have heard that it may be sold for moccasins, cut a steak from its haunches, and leave the huge carcass to smell to heaven for you. It is no better, at least, than to assist at a slaughter house. This afternoon's experience suggested to me how base or coarse are the motives which commonly carry men into the wilderness. The explorers and lumberers generally are all hirelings, paid so much a day for their labor, and as such they have no more love for wild nature than wood sawyers have for forests. Other white men and Indians who come here are for the most part hunters, whose object is to slay as many moose and other wild animals as possible. But, pray, could not one spend some weeks or years in the solitude of this vast wilderness with other employments than these, employments perfectly sweet and innocent and ennobling? For one that comes with a pencil to sketch or sing, 1,000 come with an axe or rifle. What a coarse and imperfect use Indians and hunters make of nature! No wonder that their race is so soon exterminated. I already, and for weeks afterward, felt my nature the coarser for this part of my woodland experience, and was reminded that our life should be lived as tenderly and daintily as one would pluck a flower. With these thoughts, when we reached our camping ground, I decided to leave my companions to continue moose hunting down the stream, while I prepared the camp, though they requested me not to chop much nor make a large fire, for fear I should scare their game. In the midst of the damp fir wood, high on the mossy bank, about 9 o'clock of this bright moonlight night, I kindled a fire when they were gone, and, sitting on the fir twigs, within sound of the falls, examined by its light the botanical specimens which I had collected that afternoon, and wrote down some of the reflections which I have here expanded. Or I walked along the shore and gazed up the stream, where the whole space above the falls was filled with mellow light. As I sat before the fire on my fir twig seat, without walls above or around me, I remembered how far on every hand that wilderness stretched, before you came to cleared or cultivated fields, and wondered if any bear or moose was watching the light of my fire, for nature looked sternly upon me on account of the murder of the moose. End of Part 2, Section 13, recording by expatriate in Bangor, Maine.